She's a former footballer who won the Champions League and captained her country at World Cups and the Olympic Games. Rebecca Smith is one of the most recognizable names in women's football.
This is why we love sport.
Now helping to grow the game and involved in tackling some of its biggest problems, Beck Smith tells me why she thinks the women's game is going to be bigger than the men's equivalent. This is the InnerView. And Rebecca Smith joins us now on the InnerView. Champions League winner, former Wolfsburg, former New Zealand captain at the Olympics and the World Cup, and now somebody in many roles in the women's game and beyond. And we'll talk about all of that because we have time. Good to have you on the program, Rebecca.
Thank you so much for having me, Imran. What a great show, too. I hadn't heard of it before, so it's been really cool to watch some of the clips and highlights from before. You've had some amazing guests. I feel very honored to be here. Thank you.
Very cool. We are honored. Thank you so much. We appreciate that. Because we have time, let's, I guess, start at the very beginning. When I say former New Zealand captain, you don't have a Kiwi accent. And you grew up in the US. Tell me a little bit about your footballing or soccer journey beginning in America.
Yeah, so my parents are Kiwis. They very much have the Kiwi accent, and I was born in LA with my sister, and we grew up sort of spending time in LA and also in Christchurch. My parents wanted us to know our family down there, so all of our extended family is still in Christchurch. And I played a lot of different sports, actually. I didn't want to become a professional footballer. I wanted to be a professional surfer, just for the record. But my mom said I wasn't allowed to travel around on beaches, so I had to get an education, which I did from Duke University in North Carolina. So I studied economics and Spanish there and captained the team while I was in university. And there wasn't a professional league at the time in the US, but at my senior year of college, I got called up to play for the New Zealand national team for the 2003, which feels like 100 years ago, World Cup qualifiers. And from then on, I really fell in love with playing for my country. It felt really like home. And through that, I got to then play professionally in Frankfurt, where there were no agents at the time. So I just had to figure out where the clubs were, what the professional leagues were. And there weren't very many professional leagues at the time. And there were probably only a handful of clubs that could afford an international player at that time. So I was lucky enough to start in FFC Frankfurt, who were the European champions at the time. And then from there went on to play in Sweden for 3.5 years. And then down to Australia for a season, back into Wolfsburg, where, as you mentioned, we won the Champions League. So I was pretty lucky to get the timing right and just ended up in the right team at the right time.
So that's an interesting opportunity for us to compare and contrast past and present. If we look at you at, I would guess, what, 20, 21 going to Frankfurt? If you compare
Correct.
Beck Smith at that time to a 20 or 21-year-old version of you today, how different is the women's game? How many more opportunities are there for that 20 or 21-year-old?
That is such a great question, Imran, because it was a lifetime ago and it feels like a completely different universe from when I started. No agents, only a handful of professional clubs. They weren't even really that professional, to be honest. And when I moved to Wolfsburg in 2009, we didn't have a strength and conditioning program at all. So think about all of the ACL injuries that are coming now in the women's game. They were very, very prevalent at that time. So it was very unprofessional in the sense that not a lot of the players could play full time. I was lucky enough that as an international player, I could do that. But nowadays, at 21 years old, and obviously it depends where in the world you are 21. And, you know, in the US and in countries like Sweden and Germany and the UK, specifically in England, who are really investing heavily into women's football. There are so many great opportunities to play in a variety of different clubs at different levels. But still around the planet, there are a lot of challenges still for young girls and women to be able to play, even participate in the women's game. So I still think that there's a long way to go in terms of making sure that there's equality and equity for girls and boys to be able to play any sport for that matter at a young age.
As people compliment the growth of the men's game in the US, there's a bit of a backhanded element to it because they say things like, it used to be a sport only for girls in the US,
Yeah.
right? And sort of
Yeah.
injected into that is this idea that there was infrastructure and there was support for women's soccer in the US, but it was mainly revolving around schools and maybe colleges, but not beyond that. How did that unfold and evolve over the years?
Yeah, the U.S. system is really interesting because they obviously were number one for a long time until this last World Cup where they were catastrophically terrible. And I think it's fair to say that. But the structure that they have in the U.S. is pretty amazing. And a lot of that is down to Billie Jean King and some of the work that she did in tennis, but also Title IX, so that university systems have equal investment on men's and women's programs. And that started out as actually an academic programs, but it carried on and trickled into sporting programs in the U.S., which meant that girls had the same opportunity to have equal number of scholarships to go to universities to play. And I think that then trickles down, because if you're a parent who's looking for funding for your kid to go to university and you have a young girl or a young boy, you're going to look at them fairly equally in terms of they both have the same opportunity to play and make the same amount of money, or save the same amount of money to go to universities. Whereas, you know, in different parts of the world, it's not the same, that girls don't have that same opportunity to play. There's certainly not as much money at the top end for girls. But I think the U.S. system is a really good one in the sense that it does allow for equal opportunities from a very young age.
You spoke about the U.S. doing catastrophically badly in that World Cup in Australia and New Zealand. And other countries from Africa, from Asia, from South America doing better than expected. Does that mean that the game is growing and blooming in those places, or it was just the luck of the draw and tournament football and we shouldn't read too much into it?
Yeah, it's a great question again, Imran. I don't think that there's really much to do with luck when it comes to sports. I think that the biggest difference historically has been, one thing that you kind of touched on was the cultural differences. So in the US, it is a girls' sport. And so therefore, girls are allowed to play and encouraged to play because they could see that there's a long-term plan for them. They could play in World Cups, they could play in Olympics, they could be professionals, they could get sponsorship deals from different brands. But I think in different countries, they haven't had that same opportunity. And it really comes down to investment. So this is what I talk about quite a lot, and why I started my company, is that there hasn't been that same investment in the federations, in the clubs, in those different countries. And a lot of it, I think, is social and cultural acceptance that girls can play sport and that they should be encouraged to play sport equally, if not more, than boys, for reasons of confidence and communication and teamwork and all the different things. So I think there's always two layers to the reason why women's sports hasn't developed as much as it could globally, because you have not only the lack of investment, but there's that extra layer of, yeah, but culturally, is it okay for girls to play? Is it encouraged for girls to play?
Yeah, you say lack of investment. Money is a big thing, and we read about and talk about equal pay, and that's usually on one level. It has to do with national teams, you know, paying the men and the women the same amount. But the whole economics of football worldwide seems to be driven by club football, right? And so you have these, you have UEFA, for example, with the men, and these massive Goliath clubs with unbelievable amounts of money. We saw the Super League attempts. We're seeing the Saudis now coming in with extraordinary money. Do you have hope that women's football could grow to the extent that that amount of money would be invested into women's football?
Yeah, so many comments I have about that question. Again, really interesting is, one is, what is the objective and goal of sports? And I think the objective and goal and goals of sports is not just measured by how much money we can make. I think that one of the reasons why I stayed in women's football was surely not just because I think it's commercially going to be, and I mean this when I say it, bigger than men's football, because I think that it's grounded on totally different values. And those values are much more accepting. There's much more diversity, inclusion. You know, we don't see homophobia like we do in the men's game. We don't see racism like we do in the men's game. It's based on, you know, very much an inclusion. We had just two women getting married from the U.S. women's national team about, 5-10 years ago, and celebrated all throughout America. And so that sets precedents for for a cultural and social change in places and areas and countries that don't allow for those types of things. So for me, that is a more important driver for working in women's sports, because I think it can be a really great way to change culture and society and open up more opportunities for women, not just on the pitch, but off the pitch in their private lives and their business lives. But yeah, I do think that the broadcast money is really where it all comes from. It's all broadcasters putting in big money to pay to be able to watch it. And I think there's been the wrong type of assumption that there is no audience that wants to watch women's sports. And we've seen that assumption being blown out of the water when we've seen the Women's Euros last summer, when we've seen the Women's World Cups, when we've seen the Women's Champions League. So when there are high quality competitions, there's no question that there's a huge global audience. And we've seen it in tennis, that the final for the women's tennis was bigger than the men's. So I think that lack of understanding, and because there's been decision makers in sports and mostly in broadcasting that have decided not to invest in it, there hasn't been that trickle down effect of there's more investment so we can put that into the participation, so we can improve the quality of the product. Because if that money goes into the clubs or into making players better, then the quality is going to be better, then more people are going to want to watch. So it's that cycle, isn't it? But certainly I do, and I mean that when I say that I think women's football will be bigger than men's football eventually. And I know people laugh.
Yeah, and I mean, I also don't want to belabor the point in sort of comparing the two, the men's game and the women's game constantly. Maybe we'll do like 2 more questions about that only. Yeah. But interestingly, like in the men's game, you have the Ronaldos and the Messis, these superstars who almost transcend the sport these days, where you have young people. And something that's very weird for me to see, especially with social media, is that you have people loyal to players, not really loyal to clubs anymore. You know, they'll follow Ronaldo wherever he goes. They'll follow Messi wherever he goes. Maybe you have Neymar in a kind of a tier just below them. He won't like that. But, you know, you have these superstars, right? Are we going to see the equivalent type of superstars as mega brands like you have Serena Williams in tennis?
Yeah. And again, it comes back to almost the same answer that I would say in the last one, is that it comes down to the investment. So the reason why these men can be such superstars is because they're on TV everywhere. Their brands' sponsorships are enormous, and they put massive money behind the media, paid media behind, you know, some of these sponsorships that they have with, you know, the Pepsis, the Nikes, whatever they are. So I think it takes the money being invested into the broadcast so that people can see them and they become aware of who these players are, who these people are. And then therefore they can follow them and they can like them. So again, it always comes back to the economics of the sport. It's not about the value and the merit of those athletes not being as good as a Messi or not being as good as a Ronaldo, because I would argue, and you know, I also don't like to compare too much, but I would argue that some of these American, you know, or sorry, some of these female players like Alex Morgan, who is American, or Megan Rapinoe, they stand for something so much more than the Ronaldos and Messis. And that's not to put down Ronaldo and Messi. They're amazing players, you know, but these women are also social activists. They are fighting for, you know, Black Lives Matter. They're putting their necks on the line to try to drive change for the better, not just for women. So I really do think that, you know, as a global brand, the female football, women's football, and those female athletes are just incredible brands to get behind and to invest in, because they're amazing people. They're amazing humans that are changing things. So yeah, it's not, doesn't come back to are they as good an athlete as them, because they haven't had the same amount of investment and time in playing and the same quality of coaching and same facility access as some of these male players have, but they're starting to get it. And we are already starting to see some huge global brands, especially in the women's England team here specifically, but they are just blowing things out of the water, and it's really, really fun to see.
Yeah, that World Cup seems to have been a watershed moment over the past couple of years. And my brother and my friends and I, the guys who tend to talk about football in WhatsApp groups, it feels as if we're having our brains rewired as well, because following women's football is not a natural thing to us. We follow men's football, but it's something that's becoming more normalized, and something that a lot of guys, knuckleheads like myself and my friends, a lot of guys would have been saying, in being acquainted with the women's game, is that there's almost a feeling like it's a throwback to the stuff that we missed in the men's game, because the men's game became so physical. There became so much of an emphasis on, I guess, the speed and the strength and that sort of thing. So,
diving.
Diving as well. We tend to compare it to the kind of golden age, or sort of the 80s and the 90s, where it was slightly more technical and less physical, because you're seeing more technique on the field with a lot of the women's football. Would you say there's that qualitative difference on the field, where it's actually a more technical game than the men's game right now at the highest level?
Yeah, another really interesting question. And I think, I'm probably not as qualified to answer that, but a lot of the sports scientists that have been studying the games, and I know that when I was working at FIFA, we did some camera tracking so that we could actually track the development of the sport. So we could see, what is the percentage of maximum speed that they're doing, how far are they running. One of the players on the Spanish team ran 14.1 kilometers in one game. I mean, that's equal to, if not more than, any of the male players that are playing in these tournaments. So there's certain things that you can compare, I think, and that are certainly quite interesting, and other things where, we watched the 100-meter sprint in the Olympics. We watched the male one do it in whatever that time is. We watched the female do it in a larger time, so she'll never be able to compete. But we don't talk about it because they're both amazing in their own rights. But I do think what's interesting about what you said is that the development of the women's game has been slower. It has taken longer, because when you think about the history of football, by definition, it has only included men for so many years. And not only has it been, global decision makers have been men, for men to play with male referees, so no wonder it's mostly male fans. But equally, you also have all the decision-making people in broadcast, in brands, that have all been men traditionally. So there is a bias towards, then we're going to continue with the status quo. There's also been a lot of bans in football. Women were not allowed to play for 50 years in England, in Italy, in Germany. So they weren't allowed to actually play. So they're 50 years behind technically. So we're seeing that the quality of the game is catching up to where the investment is, and the amount that these players are literally being allowed to play now, in a time where they were not allowed to play. So I certainly hear a lot that people, when they compare, they say that the women don't dive as much, that they just get up and get on with it. They're not looking for the fouls. They're looking to play. And I do think that is an accurate account of
the skill,
when you watch.
And the skill level on the ball is immense. I mean, it's
very good.
In many ways much better than the men's level, right? Which is a breath of fresh air. And I think that's one of the reasons why you have so many people now wondering why they didn't connect or acquaint themselves earlier with women's football. You spent some time with FIFA, and FIFA has this. There's two sides to the FIFA coin. It has a reputation. On the one hand,
you can say it. It's okay.
I mean, it's a mega institution that has faced criticism over the years. Tell me, what was the biggest lesson that you learned from your time in the system working for FIFA?
Yeah, it's a tough one, because I learned a lot. What it enabled me to do was to be able to travel the world and really see what football was. And what I realized was I was very ignorant about how football is run globally, how it is run domestically, who makes the decisions, how they make the decisions, and what impact that has then on all the different constituents. And most of the time I was looking at it from a girls and a women's football perspective. And I have to say that it was disappointing. It was disappointing to see that there was a lack of diversity in those decision-making bodies, that there were huge biases against the women's game and women's football, that there was a lack of understanding, I think, as well in terms of business, that the women's, football is the #1 participatory sport on the planet. It's the most easily accessible sport on the planet. So to literally actively ignore and suppress 50% of the planet to be able to play and watch the game felt like, to me, a big miss from a commercial sense as well, from a business sense. So I saw a lot of amazing things. I got to travel and see the inspirational side of football, how it could change culture and society. The Under-17 Women's World Cup in Jordan is still one of my most favorite moments ever, seeing these girls in hijabs, wearing them for the first time on an international stage, seeing stadiums filled with men, women, all different, religions, any kind of background in Jordan supporting these young girls was absolutely amazing and a huge change from what was before. But I also saw a lot of the bad side, really bad side of football. And that's what's made me want to stay in it more, because I want to drive that positive change. I want to get more stakeholders involved. I want them to see the positivity that women's football has in and around it with the athletes, as we've already spoken about. And I really think that with women's football driving some of the narrative, we can actually clean up some of football.
Were you always preparing for this type of role in the game? Your career was cut short in 2013. You had your knee injuries. You were in your early 30s back then. You speak multiple languages. You've got multiple degrees. You're heavily credentialed and you're a very smart person. Were you always thinking that you wanted to be involved in the game at an administrative level in order to change the game?
Like I said, I really didn't want to get involved in football because I had seen there wasn't that much opportunity for girls, even having grown up mostly in the US and seeing the, the women's national team. It wasn't really a massive goal that I had. But once I got involved and I started seeing all of the issues and also the power of football, because so many people play, because it's so easy to get into, and because there's so much passion behind it, I really felt like, we have so many global issues and crises at the moment. And where do you look for solutions? Where do you look for leaders that are really strong? And where do people look for leadership? And when you look at governments nowadays, and I think the younger generation, I'm not really in the younger generation, thanks anyway, but
it's okay, we're together. We're together, yeah.
Okay, good.
To any of the young people watching us right now, they can listen to this.
Yeah, exactly. And they may or may not disagree, but I think there's sort of a backlash and they're coming back around. But I think there's a disconnect between, government and politics and them understanding what, countries need nowadays. But when you look at like a Ronaldo or an Alex Morgan, or even a Beth Mead from England, when they say certain things, or Leah Williamson was just recently with, I believe it was UNICEF, or with the refugees, when they go and they bring light to these topics and they say that they're important and we need to, get involved in it, when we need to have more girls being able to have access in schools. The government has been trying to push that for decades here in England. The England national team, the Lionesses, won the Women's Euros. They then wrote a letter to government saying that all girls should have access to be able to play in schools. And then two months later, that was granted. So I think the power that these players have, the power that the sport has, is so important. So I saw that firsthand at FIFA. And I think that, for me, there's no better mechanism or driving force that you can use to be able to change things for the better than football, and specifically women's football and female athletes. Obviously, I'm biased, Imran. So.
With some things, there is the proverbial straw that breaks the camel's back. It would be remiss of me not to ask you about the kiss that was more than a kiss, Rubiales versus Hermoso, and all the fallout. What was a sort of subplot became the headline after a magnificent World Cup and a great win for Spain. Tell me what that entire scandal means to you and what it says about where we are at with the game and all these various issues that you spoke about in the past 25 minutes.
I think women's football is reflective of society. So often we see female athletes and women's sports, on the platform, on the champions stand, trying to celebrate. And in the background or overshadowing that is constantly these social issues that women have to deal with. And to be really honest, it's nothing new. This has been going on in the Federation for many years, documented, where players have, tried to kick out or have gotten a few of the officials and head coach removed previously. It's not a one-off. It's not in a bubble. It is prevalent in women's football globally, where there's sexual abuse, sexual harassment that these women have to constantly fight just to be able to play. So in one way, it's terrible that it happened. In the other, I'm really glad that the Spanish team won, because they can bring these issues that are there globally to light, and that we can actually see the globe and the whole planet really reacting and supporting Jenni Hermoso and what's going on. And I think what it does is it highlights some of the issues and challenges that women and girls have all over the planet. And it's not just in football. It's everywhere. So it's sort of a bittersweet one for me. But what I was really proud of is the global response and the support that Jenny Hermoso, the Spanish team, have got. And I think what it's going to do is it's going to really force the hand of a lot of federations and governing bodies to make change. And I think that's one of the reasons why I went into media from FIFA, was because I saw you're at these governing bodies, you're trying to make change from within. No one really cares. You're a total minority. And then something happens on a global stage in media, in storytelling, where everybody can see. There's a lot of pressure. There's a lot more pressure for things to change. So unfortunately it happens, but you know, I think again, women's football is just a reflection of society, and I'm glad that it's being dealt with, kind of. Still ongoing, isn't it?
Yeah, ongoing legal issue as well. Yeah. Rebecca Smith, we're out of time, but it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Imran. Good luck, all the best.
Thanks, you too.
You too.